Hello, I am Vicky Manitou Okas, and welcome to the Container Gardening Workshop. In this session, we are going to be putting together some tiny little gardens for my summer um, vegetables and herbs. So, there's some ideas for you to put together for yourself, and I'm going to explain how I do it as I go along. So, hey, join along and go plant your own tiny little gardens. And I invite you to join me at Delectable Tiny Gardens, the meeting place in support of people developing food security and resiliency. So let's get started. Today, we're going to be putting as many tiny gardens together as I can in this hour. I've got a lot planned, and I'm probably not going to get them all done today. But as I do the containers, I will film later what I'm doing and take pictures as everything is developing and growing and filling out the pots so that you can see the whole process as it unfolds. But realistically, it's going to take several weeks for these containers to develop to their full potential. Now, what I am using today I'm using two different potting mixes. Okay. One was a potting mix that we had a truckload delivered, or a garden mix for the raised beds that we had a truckload delivered, that is a 50-50 mix of a high quality compost and high quality soil. So I used some of that in some of these beds. The other mix is an um, organic potting mix and mushroom compost and sand. So it's two parts organic potting soil, 1 part mushroom compost, and 1 part sand. All right. And I mix that all together, and that's the other potting mix that I'm using. So um, I'll be able to tell you which is better at the end of the season, and I'll take notes for myself as well. But a lot of times, if you're using sometimes I'll use a vermicompost or worm compost in my potting mixes, and peat moss or coco coir. Coco coir is actually a more sustainable product at this point. So it really depends on what's on hand as to how I create my soil for my containers. The other part is that to improve drainage, sometimes I put broken ceramic pots in, or flat stones, sometimes a little bit of wood sticks and small sticks and stuff in the bottom of the container. And that helps improve the drainage a little bit, and it makes those containers a little bit lighter. So there's a lot that you can do. The other thing that makes your potting mix lighter, if you're going to be moving the pots around, is to use perlite instead of sand. Okay. Both are natural products. Perlite is an expanded ash of some sort, and but sand is more common in this area as a natural product that is easily accessible. So either way, the perlite's going to be lighter. The sand is going to be very heavy. Just whichever works best for you. Okay, these two coffee cans, and this is the bottom out of vegetable tray out of an old refrigerator. So these are the first three containers that I am going to plant today. And I'm going to use my custom mix for the two coffee cans and the refrigerator tray is the mix that we bought from the nursery. So in one of these coffee cans, the first coffee can, I am going to plant chives. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do to plant those, well, I'm going to do that later. So because I want to be able to hold on to that, so I'm going to trim that off later. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put some of the mix into the coffee can. And I'm not going to get real fancy about it. Okay, what I did was you can see I've got it about half full and pushing that up on the sides a little bit. Okay, then I'm going to take, chives are pretty tough. This is going to bruise them, but I'm going to take the chives by the tops and work that down into the coffee can. Okay, yeah. This was a bunch that I had in my the pair of jeans that I converted to a planter last year. So that was sitting in the garden, so I salvaged that. And I'm going to replant that into this coffee can, and then just work, spread out those roots and work the soil down around there. And whether you're starting with a big bunch like that, or whether you're starting with a starter, okay, the other thing I want to do is I want to plant that at about the same depth that it was growing before. Okay, so work that down around. And this coffee can, it's about 6 inches in diameter. That is plenty big to grow a clump of chives. And that's actually going to grow a lot of chives to be able to eat and add to salads and everything else. So ideally, the soil got rained on overnight, but ideally you're going to water that in to settle that soil and amongst the roots. So that's draining out very quickly. It's going to drain all the way through. And you see I need to add a little bit more because that washed that down in. That's why I always water in my plants. It's no matter how wet that soil is, I water in the plants because it helps settle that soil around the roots so that I don't have to worry about air pockets in there. And this is ready to the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the top off of those chives. Okay, because I want that to be developing the roots and not putting the energy into the flowers and the tops. So cut that off that's about 3 inches tall at this point, and that'll put the energy into the roots so that it develops into that can. Set these aside. I'll use those for supper tonight. And this one is ready to go. That should just go outside for the summer. Okay. Now I've got a second coffee can here, and I've got some cilantro. So I also want some nice cilantro for salsas and salads for the summer. And one of the reasons I like putting the cilantro in a container like this is so I can move it to the shade. I can put it in the sun when the weather's cool, and I can move it to the shade when the weather's hot, and that extends the harvest on the cilantro. Okay, this time the cilantro is in one of the toilet paper rolls. Okay, so I'm going to fill that a little bit fuller. Okay, make a little hole in there. Okay, now I only want about 2 plants in there, so I am going to trim out one of those. I already trimmed some of those out and used it for salad, but I'm going to trim out the one that is the leggiest. Okay, and I'm going to take that. Okay, because that toilet paper roll will wick the moisture away from that cilantro. Okay, there's some advantages to having that toilet paper roll on there. It would that would reduce cutworms if you have cutworm in your soil. They won't go through that toilet paper roll. But in this case, I don't have that problem. So I'm going to bury this one just a little bit deeper than it's growing in the pot because those are just a little bit leggy. So very gently. And I'm not going to bother watering this in because I don't need to settle that around the roots. So that's looking pretty good. And we'll set this outside. And let that grow up. And I'll keep an eye on this. When it rains, it'll settle that a little bit. I may have to add a little bit more soil to that as the rain settles that soil a little bit. Simple as that. And that cilantro will grow about that tall and fill that pot in about 2 or 3 weeks. Okay. This container, the refrigerator tray, I'm going to plant strawberries in, and so this is divided here. So this is beautiful. So on one side, I am going to plant the chives, okay? And the other side, I'm going to plant strawberries. Okay, the chives will help protect those strawberries from pests because most of their pests do not like the smell of the chives, okay? And that this will keep the two separated so that the chives don't spread into the strawberries. And this will give the strawberries a nice place to develop. And we'll probably, in a year or two, I'll probably move those strawberries to a more permanent home. But this will do for now. And in this case, this is a bigger clump. This also came out of the pants that I converted to um, a planter last year. So, but in this case, I am going to separate this into 2 different clumps. Okay, and you just take and very gently, okay, pull that apart. Just tease it apart. Do as little, see how that comes apart. Okay, that broke some of the roots, but mostly, if you ease it apart, they just simply come apart so very easily. Okay, now that is an interesting growth pattern right there, but that will settle out. Settle out. Okay, and again, I'm just going to use this potting mix. This has got the other potting mix in it, but I'm going to on the top put the potting mix that I made, and I'm just going to set this on top of what's there, spread out those roots, okay, and fill in with the potting mix. up to about the height of where it's planted in the where it was planted before. So put this both of those in there. Okay. And I will water that in later. Okay. And go ahead and backfill a little bit more if it needs it. This will take a while to fill in. That's plenty of chives in there to fill this whole space. But I want this a little bit more productive until then. So I'm going to put the other cilantro in here. Now I could on some of the plant and some of the plants I will, but I could just cut the top off of that toilet paper roll instead of taking it completely off because those roots will grow out of the bottom of that and that really won't that toilet paper roll won't interfere with the root development, but it will wick moisture away from it if it's above the top of the soil. Okay, now again, there's too many of them in there, so I am going to cut out the one of those that is the leggiest. I just want two in there. So cut that one out. Okay. And again, I'm going to cut the chives back to about 3 inches and let that regrow. Okay. All right. Now I'm going to put these are labeled with cilantro, so I'm actually going to put that in here so that label stays with it for a little while. Okay. Now the other thing that I'm going to put in here is strawberries. So we bought some strawberries last year, some wild strawberries. Okay. This is Fragaria virginiana. That's a wild strawberry. And because we didn't get out of the pots last year, I just set it in the milk crate and spread out the runners so that with those runners would root. So now I got to cut the runners apart. And trimming this up. All right, because those are already blooming, I do not want to mess with this too much. Just trim that up a bit. Okay. I've already got this, but I'm going to put one here. Actually, I'm just going to put one in there. We'll do something else with the other one. Put that out of the pot. Okay, yeah. Okay, I'm going to spread that apart so that those roots spread. Trim off anything that is not looking good. Okay. I'm going to take the blooms off. Okay, because I do not want that blooming yet. I want that to develop roots and good growth instead of blooms. So I always take those blooms off. Okay. And I'm going to let this fill this pot because that will actually fill the pot. And I'm going to go ahead and fill this on up with the potting mix. You don't want those crowns buried, otherwise they'll rot. So I'm just going to fill this up to the point where it's level with where they were growing in the pot. For the strawberries, if that settles, I would rather put more potting soil in there if it needs it when it settles than to have too much in. There we go. That's just about right. Now, if I had done this about 3 weeks earlier, I could have split that pot up and spread those strawberries out a little bit. But since they are already since they went to bloom already, I don't want to mess with those roots too much. I would rather just leave it as it is and let those runners spread out into this container later in the year. And as those runners spread out, I will poke them down into the soil to produce more strawberries as going forward. You don't. So, what do you think so far of those tiny little gardens that I'm putting together? Do you think that you can put together a tiny garden like that? Or maybe something that's better suited for you? No matter what you do, this is one way to develop food resiliency and security in your life, or at least learn how. So, what would you put together if you put together your tiny gardens? And hey, stay tuned, and we will put some more tiny gardens together and see what works for you. So, like, subscribe, and tell me what you want in your tiny gardens for yourself. Okay, this is one of the ways to plant potatoes, and it seems to work reasonably well. Um, so, what you do is on a milk crate, and it needs to have open sides and open bottom for this to work. But you can plant 3 or 6 potatoes in a milk crate, and you can stack them so that you can do a tower garden. But we're not going to stack them this year. We did last year, and I think it works better that if they are not stacked, because the water seems to drain out of the top one, and the top crate does not get quite enough water. So we're going to plant the potatoes in the crates again. So Anna Marie, why don't you you want the reds in this one?
Yep.
Okay, so why don't reds. Grab the potatoes, grab about 3 of those pieces of potato, Okay, and the way you do this is you line the bottom and the sides of the crate with straw or grassy hay. And I use a grassy hay because that has nutrients that actually feeds the soil. And this one's still set up from last year, so the hay hasn't completely broken down. Okay, so when you plant the potatoes in here, you plant them, scatter them evenly around the crate with the growing tips towards the edge of the crate, or either that or the cut side down. And you cut your potatoes at least 24 hours ahead of the time that you're going to plant them, so that callus is over. Okay, so that's been that. I cut that yesterday. A couple of days is actually better, so that callus is over, so instead of rotting. And then this one is starting to grow. These are potatoes that I saved from last year. And I know it's not recommended to keep potatoes in the refrigerator, but the potatoes that I am going to try and keep over the winter get cleaned up, dried up, and cured. Then I put them in the refrigerator for the winter. And these are barely starting to grow in the refrigerator from last summer's crop. So we're going to put those in there. Okay, and those will actually go through the straw and throughout the sides of the container, yep. And it will also grow up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill this in with the soil compost mix from the nursery to about 3 inches deep. And then as those, the next thing we're going to put in here, we're going to scatter a few radish seeds on top of that. Because the radishes will be ready in about 30 days. And then as those potatoes grow on up, then we'll fill in just a little bit more to fill the crate. And that actually, on some varieties, that will actually produce more potatoes if you fill as those potatoes grow. Okay, now there's two different types of potatoes. One is a determinate, the other is an indeterminate. And this works better for indeterminate type potatoes than it does for the determinate type. All right, so we'll fill that in, and we'll throw the radish seeds on top later. But intercropping is one of the ways that you get the most productivity out of a container. So when you put something in there that takes a while to grow and fill in, like potatoes, then you put in a quick crop like radishes, and you get two crops out of the same space. And I will use the same soil compost mix to go ahead and fill in. I'll probably put a little bit more grassy hay. And that's all it is to plant potatoes in a container. You can plant them in a fabric bag. You can plant them in a container like this. Potatoes do need a lot of moisture, so you got to be careful about planting potatoes in something that's going to wick the moisture away from the potatoes. So you got to balance that good drainage and good soil drainage with the wicking of the material, so that you don't rot the potatoes and you don't dry them out too much for them to grow. And that's all there is to planting potatoes. Thank you for joining with me today as we went through me putting together my tiny gardens for the summer. I hope you enjoyed the ideas that I came up with for myself. Maybe you can use some of them for you. If not, there's plenty of other things to use. And just remember that it'll be a few weeks before these gardens are producing, but it's always better to put the plants in the gardens small and let them grow into the pots than trying to fit a large plant into a tiny garden and crushing those roots. So let the roots develop into the pot instead of trying to conform them to what you have available. Start small, and it will be a much healthier tiny garden as you go forward. All right, thank you, and come and join us at Delectable Tiny Gardens. And then like and subscribe and tell me what you are putting together for your gardens in your life. All right, thank you, and join us next time.